Joined this morning by Blair Jenkins, who's the Chief Executive of Yes Scotland, and Dennis Canavan, who is the Chair of the Yes Scotland Advisory Board. Welcome to you both. We've got maybe about 90 minutes for this session, but I would remind members that they would keep their questions short and to the point. If we could have answers that are equally concise, that would be very helpful, because there's, I dare say, a broad range of issues we want to try and cover in the time that's available to us. I wonder if I could start by asking you a very similar question to the first question I put to the first panel earlier this morning. What, in your view, are the advantages to the Scottish economy from a yes vote in the referendum? And you can maybe try and answer that in sort of 2 to 3 minutes. That would be helpful.
Thank you, Convener. I'm a convert to the cause of independence, and my conversion is not based on any emotional experience. Is based mainly on my parliamentary experience. I spent 26 years as a member of Parliament at Westminster, followed by 8 years here in the Scottish Parliament. I've been retired now for 7 years, and that's given me time to think, and I have come to the conclusion that Westminster is increasingly out of touch with the people of Scotland on economic as well as political matters. Whereas the Scottish Parliament, although it's not perfect, but I think it responds far more readily and far more positively to the values, the needs, the wishes, the aspirations and the economic priorities of the people of Scotland. And let me just take just a few examples. Radical land reform, absence of tuition fees for university students, care of the elderly, no prescription charges for NHS patients. But of course, the powers of the Scottish Parliament are very limited. Most of the big decisions, the big political decisions and the big economic decisions are still taken at Westminster. And I believe that with independence, the Scottish Parliament could do so much more economically and politically. I say to myself, and I say to you as distinguished members of the Scottish Parliament, if the Scottish Parliament can be responsible for important services such as education and the National Health Service, why should it not be responsible for taking decisions on whether or not we should be involved in illegal warfare or whether we should have nuclear weapons? And similarly, on the regulation of financial institutions, if the Scottish Parliament had powers over that, we'd be able to have, to my mind, a better regime, stopping bankers filling their pockets with big fat bonuses while bringing the country to the brink of economic disaster. And if we had powers over tax and national insurance, then we'd be able to introduce a fairer, more progressive system of taxation well, a fairer system of benefits too, including the abolition of the iniquitous bedroom tax, which would never have seen the light of day if we'd had complete independence in our Parliament. So, in conclusion, I see independence not as an end in itself. I see it as a means towards building a better Scotland, a more prosperous Scotland, a fairer Scotland, and a Scotland that will play its full part in the international community to help to build a better world.
Mr. Jenkins, do you want to add anything at this point?
Add a very brief thought, if I may, Convener, to what Dennis has just said. I mean, I'm not a politician, but I know quite a few. It seems to me that in whichever party, all the politicians I know come into politics to make a difference. And I think if you imagine 2016 and the first elections to an independent Scottish Parliament, I mean, how exciting for every party in this Parliament, for every politician in this Parliament, that for the first time you'll be able to devise, to propose and then perhaps to implement a fully coordinated and integrated set of proposals to develop the Scottish economy, to do the kind of things that Dennis has just been talking about, to achieve fairer distribution of wealth, to grow our economy, to make the kind of changes that we all know we'd like to see in Scotland. So I believe that there are lots of reasons why Scotland would benefit economically from independence. We know the Westminster system is not working for Scotland. We know we need to address huge issues around inequality of wealth and opportunity. And I firmly believe, and I know we'll get into the detail of this, that the compelling arguments for Scottish independence are nowhere more compelling than they are in the areas to do with the economy.
Thank you very much. I've got a couple of issues I want to follow up on, and then I'll bring in some others. Maybe I could start off, Dennis Canavan, with yourself. I mean, you talked very passionately there about the need to have full independence, to extend the powers of Holyrood and to control the levers of power. One issue we spent quite a lot of time looking at in this committee is the question of currency. And it's always seemed to me that if you want to have an independent country to have proper control over the levers of power, power to set your interest rates, what you want to have is your own currency, not somebody else's. Would you agree with that?
Well, as you may remember, Convener, at an earlier stage in this whole debate and before the Scottish Government issued its white paper, I expressed a personal view expressing support for the principle of an independent Scottish currency. But I don't think that my own personal views are of paramount importance in this great debate. Since I made that statement in public, and I do not retract it, but since I made that statement, the Scottish Government has published its white paper and made it clear that their preference would be for a sterling currency union. And that, therefore, bearing in mind that the Scottish Government received a mandate from the people of Scotland to have this referendum and to negotiate on the terms in the aftermath of a yes result in that referendum, then as a good Democrat, I accept that the Scottish Government has the democratic right to proceed and to try to get negotiations going regarding a sterling currency union.
But you believe, as indeed I do, that if we were to be an independent country, we should have our own currency, because that gives us the maximum economic freedom. Why then do you think that the Scottish Government in their white paper are not proposing that, if that's the optimum outcome? Is it just because they're not trying to scare the horses in advance of the vote in September?
No, I think if you look at the commission, the independent commission, which the Scottish Government set up, including some distinguished Nobel laureates who know far more than I do about economics, and I think that there are pros and cons in each of these options, and I think that the Commission said in so many words that any of the four options which they put forward would be workable in an independent Scotland. And the Scottish Government has, in its white paper, outlined the reasons why it prefers to have a sterling currency union. It intends pursuing that despite the opposition that has been expressed by the UK Government. And in my view, in my humble opinion, I think that the UK Government would be cutting off its nose to spite its face by not negotiating on that matter, because there would be certain disadvantages to the rest of the UK economy, not just the transaction costs, but more importantly, the growing trade deficit which would arise as a result of the loss of oil and gas revenues.
I think, Convener, courtesy of the Guardian newspaper, we now have a much clearer idea of what the UK Government's real position is on currency union as opposed to what politicians say in public. There's a point you made in your opening remarks, your opening question, which I'd just like to pick up, which was you suggested that it was an absolute prerequisite of being an independent country that you set your own interest rates. There's an awful lot of countries in Europe would have to go and say, by the way, do you realise you're not independent? We'd have to go into Austria and France and Germany and saying, because the European Central Bank determines your interest rates across the Eurozone, you're not really independent. So I'm not quite sure that fully stacks up. One of the interesting things about this debate is that there are lots now of economists, and there's a long list of names, some of whom I think probably have given evidence to you, of economists who have no skin in this game, who are either have no view on Scottish independence or who are against the notion of Scottish independence, who have nevertheless said the best option for both Scotland and the rest of the UK if Scotland votes, as I believe we will in September, to be an independent country. It is in the best interest of both countries to have a formal currency union. I know certainly Professor Anton Muscatelli said that in evidence of this committee. Recently, of course, the very distinguished Beijing-based economist, Professor Leslie Young, has also said that if Scotland votes for independence, and although he didn't say so in terms, he seemed to indicate that he wasn't personally in favour of that option. But nevertheless, it was in the best interest, very clearly, of both the rest of the UK and Scotland to have a currency union in the event of Scottish independence. He described the publicly declared position of George Osborne on rejecting currency union as a subterfuge to frighten Scottish voters, and I think he was pretty close to the mark there.
Yes, I seem to remember when Anton Muscatelli came to this committee to give that evidence, he was outnumbered 4-1 on a panel of esteemed economists who took a different view. And if we're banding around esteemed economists, the Nobel laureate Paul Krugman has described the White Paper's monetary proposals as deeply muddle-headed. But can I just ask one more question, because it follows up on something that Dennis Canavan said about the White Paper. What is Yes Scotland's position on the Scottish Government's White Paper? Do you endorse it?
We endorse it insofar as that will be the starting point of negotiations. But of course, the overriding principle with regard to Yes Scotland is that we believe in the democratic right of the people of Scotland to determine their own destiny. That is what sovereignty in an independent Scotland means. Yes Scotland is not a political party. We do not set out a manifesto or anything like that. But we accept that the Scottish Government got the democratic mandate from the people of Scotland to have this referendum, and they therefore have a right and a duty, the Scottish Government that is, to set out their proposals in that White Paper for what they presumably hope will be not just as the Scottish Government in the interim stage of the negotiations, but when the election comes to the first independent Scottish Parliament in 2016, I dare say the present Scottish Government will be hoping that they will continue to be in government, but that remains to be seen. It will be up to each of the parties contesting the 2016 first elections to an independent Scottish Parliament. It will be up to each of these parties to set out their stall and to seek the approval of the people of Scotland.
Just in addition to that, it's worth saying that there are two types of content in Scotland's future. And Dennis is absolutely right that the stuff that's to do with the initial framework of an independent Scotland, the arrangements that we put in place for an independent Scotland, we agree would be the starting point for an independent country. Obviously, the White Paper also contains a great deal of content which is related to policies that an SNP government would pursue in an independent Scotland, and those are a matter, quite rightly, for the SNP.
And were either of you involved in discussions about the content of the White Paper before it was published?
Not formally, no. We have conversations rather than formal discussions, but no, I personally...
With whom? With civil servants? With Scottish
well, for example, I chair the advisory board of the Yes Scotland campaign, and included on that advisory board are representatives of various parties and people like myself who are not members of any party at all, but Nicola Sturgeon, the Deputy First Minister, is a member of our advisory board, and she attends most of our meetings, and we have sometimes had very frank conversations.
Okay. But there were no discussions. There were no discussions with civil servants prior to the publication of the White Paper.
That's also true in my case. No discussions with civil servants and no prior sight of the White Paper.
Okay. And yeah, the final question. So neither of you saw the White Paper before it was published?
No.
Okay. Thank you. Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Convener. And good morning again, gentlemen. Earlier this morning, we had the Better Together in this morning. I think it was actually an advert for a Labour Party political broadcast more than anything else, to be perfectly honest. But I asked them basically at that time was, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, has said that, of course, Scotland can be a successful independent country. And there's no disputing that, is there, gentlemen?
No, there's no disputing it at all, and I believe that the leader of the Scottish Conservatives has said something similar. Indeed, there seems to be almost a welcome but rather belated recognition on the part of many of our opponents now that an independent Scotland would be very viable.
And in fact, some of the opponents are actually supportive of yes. I mean, Labour for yes, for instance, and we have Liberal Democrats for yes, and I've even met a few Conservatives for yes. I'll maybe give their names to Murdo later so you can maybe pay them a visit. But it's really across all parties and none, isn't it? And yourself, Blair Jenkins, you're not a member of a political party, but you believe in the route and the pathway that we're taking towards the referendum for independent Scotland.
I absolutely do. I mean, as you say, I've no view on party matters, but I certainly do believe the right future for Scotland is as an independent country. One of the enormously enjoyable things about the Yes campaign, and it's a privilege to be in this job, is how many people are involved now very actively who have no connection previously with any form of political activity or any political party. I think what we've formed is a very exciting grassroots national movement, which encompasses all political views and people who simply think this is the right thing to do. I think the benefits to Scotland from this campaign, apart from the yes vote in September, will be, I think, a re-energised and a re-engaged population and a much, much more active and much more interested electorate right around Scotland. There's a lot of people got interested in stuff in the last year or two who are not just going to go back to being passive citizens, they're going to be very active citizens, including a lot of our young people. And I think we'll all get the benefit of that.
And perhaps I can come to Dennis Canavan on this. More from your experience as a Westminster parliamentarian and indeed as an MSP here in Holyrood. We've just witnessed record investment in Scotland at the moment from a variety of companies. We're also seeing extremely healthy exports. We're seeing a higher employment and lower employment than the rest of the UK. We're seeing an absolutely fantastic and successful apprenticeship programme. Do you put that down to the policies of the Scottish Government?
Partly, yes, but I believe that if the Scottish Government, accountable to the Scottish Parliament, had all the economic and fiscal levers available to it, then it would be able to do so much more to regenerate the Scottish economy, to grow the Scottish economy and to create more jobs.
The point is that companies, external companies that have maybe no political axe to grind are continuing to invest in Scotland regardless of a referendum. They have the confidence that regardless of outcomes, that there's success is in the horizon.
Yes, I think that that is a fair comment. That you know, particularly with regard to inward investment, I think that there is a good story to be told, and many potential investors do not seem to be put off by the prospect of a referendum. And I also recall a previous referendum in 1997 and a previous one to that way back in 1979, when there were all sorts of scare stories about potential investors being put off in the event even of a devolved Scottish Parliament. Well, the Scottish Parliament has now been up and running successfully for 15 years, and I think that most of these scare stories are seen to be unfounded.
I too remember the referendums that you referred to, and also remember that there were promises then of additional powers to Scotland. They weren't really forthcoming at the time, were they not?
Well, there was the famous case, of course, of a former Conservative Prime Minister who indicated that in the event of the Labour government's proposed devolved Parliament or Assembly, as it was called, not coming into existence, and then a future Conservative government would in fact bring forward better proposals for an Assembly or devolved Parliament. But, well, we all know what happened then. And as a result, the Scottish Parliament, with the creation of that Scottish Parliament, was postponed for 20 years, and I think that there was a missed opportunity for the people of Scotland.
Perhaps finally,
could I just one point, Deputy Convener, just because it's the best, the most independent and objective interpretation I've seen on this point about investment coming into Scotland in the current context was from the Ernst & Young UK Attractiveness Survey last year, where they said the possibility of independence and its potential knock-on impacts on areas such as corporate taxation appear to be having little effect on foreign direct investment decisions. There's certainly no sign of investors being deterred from coming to Scotland. If anything, the reverse appears to be true.
So finally, I mean, why do you think then that Better Together seem to be wishing to promote the fact that there would be a threat to Scotland's investment if the referendum A were to happen, and we know it's happening, and if we became independent, that we would see companies up sticks and go?
Well, I think that's a question that would be better putting to the Better Together representatives, but I think...
I'm not sure they would have answered that.
But I think if you look at the political situation, I mean, most of the leading lights in Better Together have got a vested interest, a vested political interest in keeping the status quo and keeping the power at Westminster.
Could I make just perhaps a general observation on the question you asked there, which is to say that I think, as a generalisation, because there is so little that you can find fault with and so little that's negative about the current and historic data relating to the Scottish economy, I think in order to deter people from voting yes, you have to project all sorts of fanciful and fearful notions into the future, given that the published data is pretty hard to refute.
Fine, thank you.
Okay. Margaret McDougall.
Thank you, and good morning, gentlemen. To Dennis Canavan, you mentioned in your introductory speech that fairer taxation and welfare services would be one of the benefits if we had an independent Scotland. How would that be funded, and where, how much of that would come from the taxpayers in Scotland?
Well, we would have full fiscal autonomy, obviously, and the total tax take would come from the people living in Scotland, or, of course, companies based in Scotland. And that is how our public services would be funded in an independent Scotland.
So it's without doubt, then, that there would be increases in taxation for everyone.
It's not without doubt. It would depend on which party actually won the 2016 general election in an independent Scotland, and indeed subsequent elections in independent Scotland. And as I said previously, it would be up to each party, including the Scottish Labour Party, to put out its proposals. I think I indicated previously that my preferred option would be to see a much fairer, more progressive system of taxation. And speaking personally, that means for me that the rich would pay a bit more, the not so rich would pay less, and the very poor would not be paying anything at all.
But we've heard from the panel this morning and from previous witnesses that there are much fewer higher rate taxpayers in Scotland than there is in the rest of the UK, and the tax base itself is about 2.4 million people who are paying tax. 2.4 million. 2.5 million. Yeah. So there's a much smaller base to start from. So surely, if we're going to try and better the welfare system, and there's got to be increases in tax if we're to balance the books.
I listened to some of what Alistair Darling said previously, and I think that he indicated that size is not of paramount importance, that even a relatively small country can bring about a degree of redistribution of wealth. But of course, we've also got to look at the creation as well as the redistribution of wealth. And I have every confidence that in an independent Scotland, we would have a government or governments elected that would get a balance between the need to create wealth, while at the same time ensuring that that wealth which is created is more equitably distributed amongst the people of Scotland.
And how long do you think it would realistically take to set up a new tax system? and all the relevant institutes around that.
I think the present Scottish Government has indicated that there would be a transitional stage where they would be using basically HMRC, or at least in part. But I would say that by shortly after the first elections to the Scottish Parliament in 2016, we could get things moving fairly quickly. I wouldn't like to put an exact figure on it, but these are challenges which I'm sure that we're quite capable of responding to, and even the Calman proposals, if and when they become a reality, they would require certain changes in the Scottish taxation system. So I don't see that these problems are insurmountable.
You know, well, I suppose we can, you know, call them challenges if you like, but it is a huge undertaking to set up a new tax system and welfare system. Well,
it's a big challenge, but it's certainly not an insurmountable challenge. I mean, if you look at the poverty that occurred in the Republic of Ireland or the Irish Free State when it had to start all of these things off from scratch, and they managed it. And if a wee country like that can do it with the poverty that existed in Ireland in the 1920s, heavens above, surely in Scotland, with their expertise and relative wealth, we could rise to the occasion.
There's likely to be that period. You're saying you could maybe do it within under 2 years, but in actual fact, it could take a lot longer than that for that system to actually benefit the people of Scotland.
I don't see it lasting a long time, but in the transition stage, I would expect that HMRC would be accommodating, and we could share some of their expertise and facilities. But that would all be, you know, points for negotiation. The basic principle for which, yes, Scotland stands is that Scotland, as a sovereign country, should be independent, and that means having our own tax system.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've heard from ICAS's report this week that it would cost at least £750 million to set up the system. Who would bear the cost of all that?
Well, obviously, the Scottish Exchequer would bear the cost of that. But if in the interim we were sharing resources with HMRC, then there would be obviously a sharing of the burden.
I think just to add a little bit to what Dennis is saying there, whatever the challenges, and of course there are always challenges, but whatever the challenges in developing a distinctive Scottish tax system, I think it has to be seen as one of the great opportunities of independence would be to escape from what is very widely regarded as the overcomplicated and unwieldy and inefficient UK tax system with its very high instances of evasion and avoidance. The tax system in the UK has not proved an adequate or successful regime for this country. And I think that it should be regarded as one of the great opportunities is to do something rather better and to transform that position. I think on your broader point about taxation, I think politicians in this Parliament, any party coming to the electorate in 2016 seeking to raise taxes, would face the problem that there has been a general loss of public trust in politicians and confidence in politicians, which I have to say is not particularly to do with the politicians in this Parliament, and is much more to do with the politicians in the Westminster Parliament. But one of the jobs of this Parliament, once it becomes independent, as it will in a couple of years, will be to rebuild that sense of trust and confidence with the electorate to a point where if a party does have a sensible and balanced set of proposals which might include an adjustment to the taxation rate, that people are willing to place their trust and confidence in you.
But if you're to pay, you know, for good services, you've got to pay someone, you know, there's got to be a balance there. So you can't just say, well, it'd be, you know, idealistically we would like to start from scratch and have a much better tax system, but you've got to be realistic and say, well, there is a cost to that.
Yeah, but we have the great advantage.
And no matter which political party would be in, you've got to balance the books. So if you want to have a better welfare system, you've got to pay for it.
Well, we know from all sorts of people, and fairly recently from the Bible of the City of London itself, the Financial Times, that an independent Scotland would begin life with a stronger set of public finances than the rest of the UK. And we also have the benefit now of 30 or more years of official data to demonstrate that relatively the Scottish economy, Scottish public finances, have been in a better and healthier state than those of the UK as a whole. So again, I think we ought not to be afraid of any challenges in this. This is the stuff that independent countries do. The opportunities far outweigh the challenges.
Okay. Alison Johnson.
Convener. Good morning. I think I'll probably address this question to Dennis. You said at the beginning this morning that Westminster is increasingly out of touch with the wishes of the Scottish people. Do you think this is in part because the Scottish people didn't vote for the Westminster government, and the Westminster government is all too aware that it doesn't actually need the votes of the Scottish people to stay in power? I mean, Better Together, they were absolutely determined this morning that constitutional change isn't the answer to the challenges Scotland faces, that constitutional change isn't required to enable us to maximise the opportunities that Scotland has. Do you think that's a credible view?
Well, there's a massive democratic deficit in Scotland, and I suppose the most obvious illustration of that at present is that we have a Tory-led coalition government at Westminster, and yet that lead party in the coalition has a magnificent total of 1 out of 59 Westminster parliamentary constituencies. 1 out of 59. And yet, under the existing constitution, the Westminster government can impose policies on the people of Scotland, policies which we did not vote for and policies which we do not want. And it is that kind of alienation of people from government which has led to a situation whereby I think Westminster is completely out of touch with the people of Scotland, whereas, as I said previously, the Scottish Parliament, although it's not perfect, like every parliament, is made up of human beings, and human beings sometimes make mistakes. But I think in its 15 years of existence, the Scottish Parliament has shown that it responds far more readily to the democratic will of the people of Scotland.
I think I've yet to understand what steps those who maintain that we're better together are going to take to address growing inequality and poverty in Scotland. I mean, certainly the evidence suggests there's a complete failure to do so. There's no vision from Better Together as to how they intend to bring about the change that's so clearly necessary. What opportunities would a yes vote provide?
Well, if I could comment just briefly on the Better Together statements. They claim that because there's a bigger pool, that gives more opportunity for the sharing of resources. These are the terms that they use: better together, pooling and sharing of resources. But it hasn't worked. I mean, it just hasn't worked, because we have now in the UK the fourth most unequal society in the developed world, whereas in Scotland, with the advantages of an independent Scottish Parliament, we'd have all the economic levers at our disposal to bring about a fairer distribution of wealth. And I do think that there is a will within the people of Scotland to accept a fairer sharer, a fairer, more sharing society, rather than what we have at present, where the gap between the rich and poor is getting wider instead of narrower.
Could I just add a little bit to that? I think it's worth saying, I mean, you're absolutely right about the levels of inequality. It's worth saying that this is not just a feature of life under the current UK government or of just the recent years of the UK. I mean, the OECD has made the point that levels of income inequality in the UK have risen faster than in any other developed country since 1975. So this is not a recent phenomenon in the UK. This is the levels of inequality, the rise of inequality and the loss of opportunity for so many of our people is something that goes back years and years, and it's not a phenomenon of the last few years. In terms of what Scotland could do to address some of these things, I mean, there is a need, I think, to do two things. Clearly, to grow the economy, and then within that growth to achieve a fairer distribution of wealth and opportunity. And I believe that this Parliament, when it has all of the economic levers at its disposal, will do more to bring in more investment. It's investment that drives growth, and I think there are all sorts of opportunities through devising the right package of incentives to secure more investment, not just by foreign ventures, foreign enterprises, but also our own indigenous companies. And it's for politicians in this Parliament to devise imaginative, creative sets of policies and packages that will do that kind of thing. But you currently, as you know, have very little power in the area of redistribution. Because you have no control over the tax system, you have no control over the welfare system. It's only by having those levers and by being able to, as I say, offer the right kind of measures to attract investment that you can really begin to get to grips with some of the long-term endemic problems that we have in the Scottish economy.
Okay, so Mark, we had a follow-up.
Just as a follow-up to the issue of inequality, you highlighted in your submission the issue of the geographic dimension of inequality within the UK, and that the UK hasn't converged in a way that other federal, quasi-federal states of the same size have. What difference do you think a yes vote would make to that? And how would you go about tackling that?
Well, you're right. It's an absolutely valid point that the regional imbalances in the UK are huge. And one of the things I would hope that any elected independent Scottish government would do in 2016, from 2016 onwards, would be to try and rebalance our economy and to revitalise manufacturing in Scotland. I think there are great opportunities there to grow the Scottish economy and to make sure that we grow the sectors, not just the ones which are of long standing. We know where we've got great resources and great success, the oil industry and other areas, but also to develop the opportunities in some of the sunrise industries like renewables.
Yes, I think that part of the problem within the UK is over-centralisation of decision-making, over-centralisation of political decision-making, and over-centralisation of economic decision-making. Whereas I think if we had an independent Scotland, that would act as a counterbalance to the pull of London, as it were, because there is an imbalance in economies, the economic spread, as it were, of the UK, whereby London and the South East seem to get huge economic benefits compared with people, not just in Scotland, but in the regions of England.
Richard Baker's got a supplementary.
Mr. Jenkins, you mentioned OECD figures, because it seems to me the situation is more complicated than you describe in terms of levels of inequality, because, I mean, don't OECD figures show that since the mid-1980s, some of those countries, which those supporting independence often refer to, the Nordic countries, in Sweden and Finland, they've had far higher rising levels of inequality than the UK.
Within the context of being a much more equal society from a starting point. So there's still the spread of wealth is still much more even in those countries.
We're still behind it, but they've been rising at far levels, at far greater levels in terms of rise of inequality than has been the case in this country.
Yes, but again, relatively speaking, in a context where those are much more fair and equal societies, I think the Nordic countries demonstrate very well the fact that you can have strong economic growth and also beneficial societal outcomes.
One follow-up on that before I bring in Chick Brodie. Where are the redistributive measures in the Scottish Government's white paper?
For redistribution, if you're talking about policy offers from the SNP, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer on behalf of the Scottish National Party. I would have thought the commitment to the living wage, the commitment to keeping the minimum wage increasing, and also to the living wages is quite an important part of that. But the policy aspects of the white paper, I think, are not really for me to comment on.
No, I understand that. I mean, both yourself and Mr. Canavan have talked a lot about independence as a route to a more equal society and redistributing income. I'm interested in this because there's not a lot in the white paper that suggests, for example, increased taxation on higher earners. That the major tax proposal in the white paper is a reduction in corporation tax, which you might suggest, as the earlier panel did, goes in the other direction. I'm not sure what's in there that suggests a more redistributive programme after independence.
To be fair, that's a question that should be put to the Scottish Government members, Scottish
Well,
Government
we'll see them in a couple of weeks, so we can ask them that question.
But the point I would emphasise is this, that with the powers proposed in the White Paper, quite as distinct from the policy preferences expressed by the SNP government, but with the powers proposed in the White Paper, that certainly gives huge potential for an independent Scottish government of whatever complexion to bring about a radical redistribution of wealth, whereas at present the Scottish Parliament's economic powers are very, very limited.
But, Mr Canavan, where is the evidence that people in Scotland have any more interest in voting for higher taxes than anyone else in the UK?
Well,
we've had the power to vary taxes in the Scottish Parliament since 1999. Only one party's ever proposed increasing taxes, and that wasn't a great success in 1999.
That's an interesting question, because if you look at the voting patterns of the people of Scotland over the past half-century or more, then most of the parliamentary representatives who have been elected by the people of Scotland have been, well, let's say within the UK political spectrum, they have been left of centre. And a left-of-centre government or potential government of Scotland would be more inclined to use the economic levers to bring about greater standards of fairness.
With respect, nobody stood for the Scottish Parliament election proposing to increase taxation. The only people who did that were the SNP in 1999, which was accepted to be a complete failure. So where's the evidence that people want higher taxes?
The powers at present vested in the Scottish Parliament are very limited in terms of bringing about the kind of radical redistribution of wealth that I would like to see. You would need the full range of economic levers to bring about that fairer society.
Could I just a little bit to that, Convener, since you raised the point? I think it goes slightly back to what I said earlier, which is I think if you're going to talk about an increase in taxation levels, then you have to do what the Nordic countries have succeeded in doing, which is have a very high level of trust between the electorate and the politicians who serve them. Where people have a high degree of trust, I think they're more willing to believe that what they pay in taxation is going to be wisely invested and will provide them with better public services. The tax differentials between UK and the Nordic countries are not as high as is sometimes represented, but such differences as there are, and there are differences, I think are based on a different kind of relationship of trust and confidence between the people and the politicians.
All right, thanks. Right, Chick Brody.
Again, perhaps I can help the convener walk through Scottish Futures, because this dwelling, the old traditional parties in London on higher taxes, doesn't, of course, look at the consideration and the elements in the paper which looks at how we develop higher incomes and more revenue and growth in the economy. So I think a high productivity, high wage economy is quite the thread runs quite clearly through the Scottish Futures paper. Just on high wages, I wonder if I may ask Dennis particularly, in a conversation or question I had to Alistair Darling this morning about his sharing of Christmas cake with Fred Goodwin and why didn't he react sooner? That's Italian Christmas cake. Appears I don't have to go through Scottish Futures now. Also, I've got to go through Mary Berry's cookbook. On 2nd of May 2012, Mervyn King, the Bank of England governor, said that action during Alistair Darling's tenure as Chancellor had been too late, and that bold action in October 2008 could have happened sooner. I wonder, and having been involved in politics in Westminster, and I worked in the city for a while, can you give me an illustration of what you think the relationship is between the Westminster government and the City of London?
Well, I think that even Alistair Darling hinted in his earlier remarks that in retrospect he and other government ministers adopted too light a touch on financial regulation, and as a result the City of London was able to just do what they did, and as a result the country was on the brink of economic disaster. It's all very well being wise after the event, but I would hope that, as I indicated earlier, that an independent Scottish government would learn lessons from the past and we would have a better system of financial regulation of banks and other financial institutions. For example, stopping the culture of bonuses, stopping or at least having a better system of monitoring potential takeovers. I think that that kind of thing, as well as just stop encouraging the whole culture of debt, which seemed to be bringing problems for many businesses and many individuals.
Thank you for that. I wonder that, again, Alice Darling wrote that he was responsible for the architecture of the UK financial regulation. We just had the Governor of the Bank of England caution the government about what some of us might call a housing bubble and the impact that that might have. I just wonder if you've any comment that we don't want to destroy the future by just looking at the present, but the present looks pretty precarious, and we seem to be in another impending financial, not crisis, but problem. Isn't it the case that with fundamental regulation and proper regulation and meaningful application of regulation, that the banking regime under an independent Scotland would be a lot stricter?
I think it probably would be. I mean, it's always difficult to say with absolute certainty what would happen in a particular situation. But I think that there is a feeling within Scotland that the people down at Westminster mishandled the economy, and lessons have been learned, and I think that there is a consensus within Scotland that there should be better regulation of banks and financial institutions.
Jenkins?
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, there's no doubt that the failings of politicians were partly responsible for the financial crisis of some years ago. The primary responsibility lies with the behaviour of the banks and with the weak governance that was in place at the banks. But it ripples through the entire system, so that the credit ratings agencies had a part in it, the regulator certainly had a part in it, and politicians had a part in it. I think it's good that the people who were in charge politically at the time should acknowledge some of the blame. It seemed for some years that the people who were in charge wished to take credit for having launched some of the lifeboats, but weren't quite so willing to take responsibility for the fact that they weren't just on the bridge, they were at the wheel at the point when we did hit the rocks. So I think it's encouraging if there's a recognition that there were political failures, not just in the UK, but in other countries as well.
Thank you. And one last question, Lemmy. Again, referring to Mr. Darling, who was here earlier. When he was Chancellor in 2008, and he's now head of the Better Together campaign, he cut corporation tax further beyond what Gordon Brown had done when he was Chancellor, from 30% to 28%, stating, "Our goal is and will continue to be to maintain the most competitive corporation tax of any major economy. We have the lowest corporation tax rate in the G7. A competitive and simplified tax regime is essential. Now, if we want to achieve a high wage, high productivity economy, that might be one vehicle." Do you think he's changed his mind, or do you think he was right then or wrong now?
I think on corporation tax, when you implement a cut in corporation tax, and as you're right, the Labour government did that. I know it's a policy proposal that's in the white paper on behalf of the Scottish National Party. You don't just look at corporation tax in isolation. So obviously you hope that a reduction in corporation tax will encourage investment, will encourage the growth of the assets of your economy. But as you say, you also have other benefits. You feel the benefits in other parts of the economy. You'd hope that your revenue from income tax would increase on the back of the investment that the lower corporation tax brought about. You'd benefit in indirect taxation expenditure as well. So the receipts that any Treasury would get from a cut in corporation tax should not just be looked in isolation at that tax on its own, but at the benefits throughout the economy. It will be up to political parties, I think, in the first elections to an independent Scottish Parliament in 2016, to set out the fully integrated set of proposals that they wish to make in the area of taxation, to see to what extent they achieve those twin goals of economic growth, but also a fairer redistribution of wealth and opportunity.
I must say that, you know, speaking personally, I'm not an enthusiastic cutter of corporation tax for the sake of handing back more money to big corporations. I would have to be convinced that there are economic benefits from any cut in corporation tax, particularly more job opportunities for people. But I think it was Gordon Brown, actually, not Alistair Darling, who first introduced in the Labour government.
Gordon Brown got it first, and then Darling pulled on.
Anyway, you know, Gordon Brown did, in fact, reduce corporation tax, and I'm therefore a bit surprised by the utter hostility which I now hear coming from some Labour people saying that any cut in corporation tax is a very evil thing in itself. As I say, I would have to be convinced about if there are other economic benefits, particularly with regard to employment opportunities.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mike McKenzie.
Thank you, Convener. You may have heard me asking Mr Darling this morning about what was on the table in terms of more powers for Scotland in the event of a no vote, and I wonder if you agree with me that this seems to be a kind of bribe of jam tomorrow if from UK politicians if the electorate do what they tell them. It seems to be pretty watery, thin kind of jam to me, but you know, irrespective of what exactly the percentage in terms of more tax powers and so on may be, do you feel what's being offered from the Lib Dems and the Labour Party, we haven't heard from the Tories yet, but do you feel that will make any real difference to Scotland in terms of being able to deal with some of the big problems and challenges we've heard about, or indeed take advantage of any of the opportunities that we would have with independence?
Well, of course, there's no way in which any of the Westminster-based parties can guarantee more powers. They seem to differ. You know, if you look at the three major Westminster parties, the Tory party has still to come out with, I think it's Lord Strathclyde who's currently looking at the matter, and he will no doubt be coming out with some statement fairly soon, but we'll have to see that before we pass judgment on it. The Lib Dems have come out with something. The Labour Party, the Scottish Labour Party, has come out with their proposals. But there is no consensus amongst these three Westminster parties as to what the exact proposals they would have regarding additional powers for the Scottish Parliament. And I mean, I'm a bit suspicious because at the time when the referendum was first mooted, there was a suggestion, and I think that the Scottish Government, the present Scottish Government, was fairly receptive to the suggestion of having an additional question about Devil Max, I think they called it, although it was never clearly defined what Devil Max means. But the Unionist parties anyway ruled out any additional question on Devil Max in the referendum, and as a result we have an element of uncertainty about what their proposals are, and also can they deliver. I mean, I think if people are seriously wanting more powers for the Scottish Parliament, the only guarantee of getting more powers would be to vote yes in this year's referendum, because heaven knows what will happen in any subsequent general election at Westminster. And of course, there is this basic point that I think it was Enoch Powell who said that power devolved is power retained, and ultimately sovereignty under the existing constitution, sovereignty is based at Westminster. The Westminster Parliament could, if it wanted, abolish your Parliament, this Scottish Parliament, completely. that this Scottish Parliament at present is a creature of the Westminster Parliament, and that, to my mind, underlines the basic democratic deficit which exists in Scotland at present.
Well, just very briefly on the remit of this committee, which is the economy, it would just seem to me that there's no set of proposals from any of the anti-independence parties that would give this Parliament control over all the potential tax sources and tax revenues that an independent nation would have, nor indeed control over the crucial area of welfare and social protection. And I think in the absence of those things, you're talking of something that's very far short of what Scotland needs.
Would you agree with me then that really what a very exciting opportunity for Scotland is that with full economic powers to shape economic and industrial policy and build the kind of high wage economy that we've talked about, that's the real prize, the real opportunity in economic terms, and that in itself would result in a higher tax take actually without raising levels of taxation, even if we continued with similar levels. Building that high wage, fairer economy wouldn't itself give rise to higher tax.
I agree that it's not simply the case that you're dependent on increasing the tax rates in order to get a bigger amount of revenue in through the tax take. That if you have more economic growth, more people in employment, then obviously even with existing tax rates you would have a larger amount of tax revenue and therefore be able to afford a higher rate of public expenditure. So the previous debate about the so-called Scandinavian model, or what happens in certain Scandinavian countries, that you must have punitive levels of taxation, it doesn't necessarily follow that if you have sufficient economic growth, then you'd be able to get more income tax and more corporation tax too, and other company taxation income in order to pay for public services.
And do you feel there's an opportunity in terms of the white paper commitment to increasing childcare to a proper level, both in terms of reducing the gender inequality, but also in terms of an economic opportunity to create jobs and by increasing participation in the workforce?
Of course, yes. Childcare and preschool education are very important. Principally, I would argue for educational opportunity for children, but also the economic benefits for women who want to get into the workplace or return to the workplace before their children start school.
Just to add briefly to that, I think I said earlier that yes, Scotland didn't necessarily take a view on the policy aspects of Scotland's future. I have to say, of all the many people I talked to within the broad Yes movement and the different political traditions they represent, I think I've found universal welcome for the proposals on childcare, for the proposals on availability of free and universal childcare. For the very reasons Dennis mentions, we have a key strategic need to grow the tax base, to grow the working population, to increase participation in the labour force. And this looks like one of the best ways of doing that. And I think it has very broad support.
Final question, Convener, just a short one. Do you agree that in the kind of zero-sum game that the Scottish Government has to work with at the moment on a fixed budget, that it's impossible to make these kind of step changes policies, game-changing policies, because increasing expenditure significantly, for instance, in childcare, implies taking it away from somewhere else that might be, very difficult to do under current circumstances?
Yes, indeed. I remember speaking about this in the Scottish Parliament when it was first set up, and indeed during previous debates in the Scottish Constitutional Convention, which led to the creation of the Scottish Parliament. I thought at the time that one of the biggest weaknesses in the proposed Scottish Parliament at that time was that it was going to be completely dependent upon another Parliament, i.e. the Westminster Parliament, for every penny that it spends. And as a result, although there are those who argue, as Murdo would, that there are taxation powers which have never as yet been used, the fact of the matter is that the budget of the Scottish Parliament is almost entirely from the block grant, And so if John Swinney or any other finance minister wanted to spend more money, say, on education, he'd have to look around somewhere in order to cut something else, because it's a fixed sum of money that he has to deal with. And this leads to very difficult choices. If you're going to increase investment in education, are you, for example, going to cut investment in the National Health Service? I mean, that's a very unhappy choice facing any finance minister, whereas if you've got all the fiscal levers at your disposal, then you can broaden your choices.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you. Richard Baker.
The comments which were made around a zero-sum game, because it seems to me that with the white paper and indeed others who are arguing for an independent Scotland, they're looking to play a zero-sum game as well, saying that there will be more generous provision on welfare, more generous provision on pensions, more generous provision in a whole range of areas, and yet not saying how these things will be paid for. We've come back to the point about taxation levels. There's no detail about where taxation levels will be, will they be up, will they be down, or whatever. I mean, do you not think it would be more honest if those supporting independence said how all these different areas will be paid for? And indeed, if they don't do that, then that case is lacking credibility.
I think you're confusing 2014 with 2016. It's for parties in their manifestos in 2016 to say exactly what they propose in terms of the public services that they would like to see in place and how exactly they propose to fund these. But the general proposition, which I think is one that's broadly supported across the independence movement, is that an independent Scotland is likely to place a higher value on having good and widely available public services than we think has been the general approach taken by the UK in recent years. The preferred method for funding that is what we've been discussing in the last several minutes, which is that you grow the Scottish economy. I think the Scottish economy, left to its own devices, would have a far better idea of what will work here economically and create a far more balanced economy, and use all sorts of incentives and levers, both to attract that investment we talked about from abroad, which we do well in, but we could do better. But also to do things like improving our business startup rate, which I think we all would agree that we need to have more innovation, a more entrepreneurial society. I would personally, when I'm looking at all your manifestos in 2016, I would be looking to see what exactly you propose in terms of incentivising people to start their own businesses. There's some recent data in the American economy which suggested that most of the new jobs being created there are coming from not from existing businesses expanding their workforce, but from new ventures coming into existence. So let's start bringing some new ventures into existence.
But the Institute of Fiscal Studies and others, and independent experts looking at our economy, haven't said that any government, or whatever political perplexion which comes in, will have, you know, if Scotland was to be independent, we'd have, you know, great extra resources with a growing economy to spend on all these different pledges which have been made by various parties supporting independence. They said that further austerity will be required. In fact, more difficult choices made over taxation or spending, either increased taxes or cut spending. Why should your analysis be believed rather than those of independent economists and economic organisations like the IFS?
Well, one of the things we know about economists is that they seldom agree with one another, and I think one thing they all do agree on is that their forecasting is seldom, if ever accurate. Now, that's true of other professions as well. I don't just wish to put that against what economists have to say. But typically, predictive models that economists put forward deal with a certain number of variables. They look at a certain number of variables, and that, for the purposes of international comparison, you're looking to compare a finite set of things. What I don't think any of the forward projections for the Scottish economy take into account, and any of the forward-looking work that's been done take into account, is, I think, if I can put it this way, is one of the things I strongly believe, the far greater energy that will run through Scottish life, through Scottish society and through Scottish economy as an independent country, the determination to make this work. Now, how you measure that or predict that in terms of what it does to productivity, what it does to economic activity, is hard to do, which is why it's not factored into those economic models. But I think, just to mention three things, I think that greater determination to succeed, I think the raising of Scotland's international profile, and I think the enormous amount of goodwill that there would be towards Scotland as a new independent nation, all provide us with an enormously encouraging place from which to start. it wasn't me who said this originally, but it's something I would endorse. It is hard to think of any other, in fact, I'd be keen to have an example cited. It is hard to think of any country that's become independent in the last 100 years, which would be doing so in a more benevolent, a more attractive-looking set of circumstances than will be the case for Scotland.
Can I just add, Convener, that it won't be the Institute of Fiscal Studies that will be running the Scottish economy in an independent Scotland. It will be the Scottish Government accountable to the Scottish Parliament. And I can understand Westminster MPs saying, you know, we want to retain power at Westminster, that is our power base, etc. But I find it very difficult to understand people who are members of the Scottish Parliament who, when you say to them, do you want to grow the Scottish economy? Yes. Do you want to create more jobs? Yes. Do you want to eliminate child poverty? Yes. But then when you ask them, do you want the tools to do the job? They seem to be saying, no, we'll just leave that to the guys at Westminster. I mean, there seems to be a lack of confidence on the part of some members of the Scottish Parliament. I would hope that collectively there would be more confidence in the Scottish Parliament, and that people who perhaps are inclined to vote no would, in the fullness of time, see that the people of Scotland and their elected representatives can form a good team to run the Scottish body politic and the Scottish economy.
And this is my final question, Convener. But Ms. Canavan, I hope you also respect the fact that there are those of us who simply believe we benefit financially and fiscally through being part of the United Kingdom. We have more money to spend on public services by being part of the United Kingdom, and that we think the relevance of having a separate country which would not be beneficial to public service and public service investment. For example, I take your point on corporation tax. Now, I rather think you and I are agreed on policies towards corporation tax, but that concern has been expressed, for example, on a race to the bottom on corporation tax. One country cuts corporation tax, another will follow to be more attractive to business investment. Business wins out, and what loses out is investment in the public sector. Don't you think that is a perfectly coherent economic argument, another argument about why we are better working together within the nations on this island?
Well, if we look at the European Union, there are still various rates of personal taxation and various rates of company taxation. And that doesn't necessarily lead to a race to the bottom. I mean, it's up to each individual country within the European Union to take into account its own economic circumstances, its own economic priorities, and implement an economic policy which is best suited to the needs of that member state within the European Union, so that most people, and certainly the view expressed in the white paper, is that Scotland wants to be a continuing member of the European Union. And it's not as if we're going to be cutting ourselves off completely from our friends and neighbours in England and Wales. That I would hope that there would still be a social partnership, an economic partnership, but the present political partnership is, quite frankly, putting Scotland in a straitjacket whereby if we want to move in a particular direction, we find that our nearest big neighbour is calling a veto on what we can do, and that, again, emphasises the democratic deficit in Scottish political and economic decision-making.
Marco Berger.
When the other side in this talk about the cost of setting up new institutions or transitions, they always seem to me to give the impression of Scotland being this desolate moorland with wolves howling in the distance, as if there's nothing actually happening here at the moment. On independence, Danny Alexander, when he came before this committee some time ago now, accepted the principle of Scotland inheriting a share of our asset, of the UK's assets, the share that we had contributed to. So how significant do you think that will be for the economics of transition, and how much of an opportunity is that for Scotland when, hopefully, we become a newly independent nation?
Are you thinking primarily there of things like the Bank of England and the currency, or other things as well?
You name it. I believe it's 1.3 trillion in assets.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly take the view, I think as do many others, that at the point at which Scotland becomes independent, there has to be an equitable distribution of assets and liabilities, and that's the basis, I'm sure, on which those negotiations would be conducted. But you're right, large parts of the infrastructure of an independent nation already exist in Scotland. We have two successfully operating pensions administration centres, for example. There's a rather regrettable and I'm sure regretted list of institutions produced, I think, by either UK government or Better Together, I can't remember which, that would have to be set up from scratch in an independent Scotland. And as I recall, a very large number of the institutions on the list turned out to be things we already had. So I don't myself believe, I would not pretend to you or to anyone else that there will not be a lot of hard work involved in Scotland becoming an independent country. It's important that people in Scotland know there will be a lot of hard work in setting up an independent country. But what I think they also will know and believe when it comes to September is that the hard work will be worth it. Is that what we can achieve as an independent country is going to be worth the fact that we're going to have to all put our shoulders to the wheel and be determined to make it work.
There is also, of course, the question of foreign-based assets, including our embassies abroad. I say our embassies because they are at present British or UK embassies, but Scotland would presumably be entitled to a share of these buildings and other assets and resources. It may very well be that in certain circumstances we may want to continue sharing our diplomatic presence with our friends south of the border or with some other European Union country. But this is very relevant to the economy of Scotland too, that very often the diplomatic presence or consular presence involves not just simply looking after people's social needs, but also trying to promote the economy of a country. And I am told by some Scottish business people that sometimes in the promotion of Scotland overseas, there isn't enough emphasis as there should be in terms of that, because again the priorities of the UK as a whole in terms of international promotion may be quite different from the priorities of the Scottish business sector. So I would hope that we could continue to get a share of assets, possibly even in certain circumstances sharing our presence in some of these embassies, but our policy in terms of international promotion of Scotland overseas would be something that would reflect more the needs and priorities of Scottish business.
And just as a follow-up, based on what you're referring to there, how much of an opportunity do you think there is for the internationalisation of Scottish business so that, yes, we continue to export to our major neighbouring market, but we also increase our exports globally and turn our face to the world?
Well, definitely, I'm with you on that 100%. I think there is a great opportunity there. We know we're already much more of an export-based economy than the rest of the UK, and I think that's something all of us would be determined to improve upon when Scotland becomes independent. I think in terms of the world overall, I think 30% of world GDP involves exports. And it's a crucial part of running your economy, that you don't just satisfy a domestic market, you satisfy international markets. I think the Scottish brand is a very, very good one. I think, as I said earlier, I think there's an enormous amount of interest in Scotland and goodwill towards Scotland. And if we have the right products at the right price, I think there's every opportunity to internationalise our economy.
And are you worried that the UK currently has a deficit of imports over exports of, I think, £72 billion, whereas Spice have told us that Scotland would be at or near surplus in our trade balance?
Well, we know, I mean, as I said earlier, we can go back over a number of years, and we know that while both countries have for most years run fiscal deficits, that the position in Scotland relatively has been better than the rest of the UK, and we can see that evidence stretching back not just 5 years but 30 years, that overall we're in a much stronger position. And as I understand it, the projected deficit for the first year of an independent Scotland would look likely to be within the range that, for instance, the European Central Bank regards as a balanced budget. So I think we have every reason to be confident.
And lastly, Joan McAlpin.
Convener, The Westminster Unionist parties are all committed to the renewal of Trident at the cost of £100 billion, I believe. What are the economic implications for Scotland in that decision, in your view, in the event of a no vote?
Well, I think I would be very confident in saying that was money that people in Scotland would regard as being not well spent, as being spent on something that is not only unnecessary but is highly undesirable and against the wishes of people here. I believe, I'm sure I'm right in saying it was Tony Blair in his memoirs who said that the only reason that the UK would not dispose of Trident, get rid of the Trident system, was because it had become an important status symbol for the country, as opposed to having any defence rationale any longer. So among the many savings an independent Scotland would make, I and I think most Yes supporters would say that the opportunity to stop wasting so much money on a completely unnecessary and immoral weapon system is one of the strongest arguments for independence.
Yes, I have found, going around the country campaigning for a yes vote, that there is overwhelming support for the removal of Trident, and opinion poll after opinion poll seems to indicate that that is the majority view of the people of Scotland. Even people who supported the retention of Trident during the Cold War have now come to the conclusion that it is rather like a very expensive white elephant. It is unusable. We saw that at the time of the Iraq War, I suppose. I mean, much as everybody disapproved of the Saddam Hussein regime, then nobody would dream of using a Trident nuclear weapon in such circumstances because of the massive loss of innocent civilian life which would ensue as a result of the use of such a weapon. So it is militarily unusable. There are strong moral arguments against it due to the almost certain loss of civilian life if it was ever used. But there's also economic arguments against it too, because the money which is spent on a Trident nuclear weapon could be used for things like education or national health service or job opportunities or whatever. So for all of these reasons, I think there would be great economic as well as social benefits from the removal of Trident.
On the subject of fear, the term project fear is what we understand the No campaign calls itself internally. And since the beginning of the year, when Chancellor made his announcement about currency, Project Fear have also talked about a dam buster strategy of... Yes, I'm coming to that, Convener.
To the economic,
I'm coming to that, yes,
Scotland's economic
absolutely.
future, please. Yes.
A dam buster strategy approach to their campaigning, which some have criticised as very negative. What do you think the implications of that are on Scotland's economy and also on your own campaign?
Well, certainly it doesn't put a good image of Scotland across. I just hope that there are not too many potential inward investors listening to all these prophets of doom and gloom who are in the no camp. You know, and I would hope that they will see the error of their ways. We are too busy in our campaign projecting positive things. You know, we don't scaremonger. I prefer to call our campaign Project Hope rather than Project Fear, or Project of Optimism rather than Project of Pessimism. And I think that message is getting through. And I would hope that even some of our opponents would realise that there is a danger if they are downplaying the success of Scotland, then this could have a detrimental effect on Scotland's economy and other aspects of Scottish life. And we keep on being told that we're all working for Scotland's best interests, although there might be different concepts of what Scotland's best interests are. But I do think that we've got to be careful in the language that we're using, because at present the eyes of the world are on Scotland, and if we're projecting Scotland as a place of no hope and all these negative things, then you know, it could have a detrimental effect on Scotland's economy.
I just think on the precise example you gave, which was the announcement in relation to the currency back in February, as I said earlier, I believe we now know from The Guardian this was a campaigning position. It wasn't something that the UK government had reached, a decision they'd reached after some prolonged period of internal discussion. The two, Alistair and Andrew, were in charge. We did what we were told. We did what they said. I think the fact that it was made so clear by a newspaper which is not in any way well predisposed towards independence, that of course there would be a currency union, said the Minister, who is a central part of the No campaign and would have, I think they said, a key role in negotiations following a yes vote. So we know this was coming from the heart of government. Of course there would be a currency union. The only reason we said anything else was for campaign purposes. I think that tells you a great deal about the nature of the campaign that's currently being waged.
On that particular subject, I raised that report with Alistair Darling this morning, and he denied that it was him that was in charge. However, he refused to say whether he had discussed matters of independence in the currency union with his friend Nick Macpherson, who of course was very involved in that particular announcement. Would it concern you if Alistair Darling had been discussing these matters with Nick Macpherson?
I'm not sure I could comment in great deal on that, because as he said, I think I do accept there are friendships which go beyond necessarily the roles people happen to be in at any given time. What I think I would say is that the journalist who wrote the story, Nick Watt, who wrote the Guardian story, seems to be very well connected at the Treasury, because he actually broke the news that George Osborne was going to formally rule out the currency union. So I'm sure he'll be paying very close attention to what Alistair Darling said this morning and checking it with his sources as to what the origins were of the sudden change of mind at the Treasury to stop saying a currency union was merely unlikely and to start saying that they were formally ruling it out.
Sometimes political collaboration can take place as a result of informal conversations between friends or former friends or civil servants and politicians, etc. But I am very suspicious about the timing of all this, and it seemed to me rather coincidental, or too much to say simply coincidence, that the three spokespersons for the three major parties at Westminster suddenly came together and said, we are ruling out completely any currency union. And it remains to be seen whether they will stick by that unanimity when they have to face up to the realpolitik and the real economique in the immediate aftermath of a yes vote.
Richard Baker, I think that's supplementary.
To help Ms McAlpine.
No, can we have a question, please?
Oh, is that a question? Indeed, well, Mr Jenkins recognised that indeed the campaign which has been brought forward, and indeed Mr Canavan, on behalf of Better Together, is indeed for more powers for this Parliament, and no one has ever suggested this Parliament should be abolished. Indeed, it could be argued that that's scaremongering, if anybody's scaremongering in this campaign.
I stated a simple fact, that this Parliament, this Scottish Parliament, is a creature of Westminster, and it is possible for Westminster to abolish this Scottish Parliament by an act of the Westminster Parliament, because sovereignty is vested in Westminster. That is a legal fact. That is not an opinion. I'm not saying that it is therefore likely that that would happen. But on the other point about the more powers for the Scottish Parliament, I referred briefly earlier to the lack of a guarantee that these powers can be delivered. The only real guarantee that people have of getting more powers for the Scottish Parliament is by voting yes in the referendum.
I think just very briefly to add to that, I mean, I don't doubt the sincerity of lots of people in various political parties who wish to see a form of enhanced devolution for Scotland. That's a perfectly reasonable position. What I do really doubt is the appetite at Westminster for pursuing that with any enthusiasm after the referendum in September. And I think whatever Scottish politicians or politicians in this Parliament may wish and hope for what might follow a no vote, which I don't think will happen, luckily, I think you'll find that the resistance at Westminster to adding anything to the powers of this Parliament will be very considerable and hard to overcome.
Given these powers being pledged prior to the no vote rather than afterwards, then I think that takes on board Mr Jenkins' concerns. But I'll leave that there, Mr Convener.
Okay. All right, okay. Right, okay, thank you. I think we're out of time. Thank you very much for coming along this morning and answering our questions, helping us with our inquiry. We shall now suspend very briefly and go into private session. Thank you.